Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where you'll find information on what's going on the North Fork of Long Island. We'll be focusing on issues and opportunities going on in the community, as well as people and stories from the present and the past. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 22, we have Southold Town Supervisor Al Krupski, and he joins us to talk about his time growing up on the North Fork with his ancestry, as well as how he got involved in politics and civics with being a trustee for Southold, as well as being on one of the board members and being a Suffolk County Legislator, and how he came back, decided to become the Southold Town Supervisor. So I hope you enjoy episode 22 with Town Supervisor Al Krupski. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today and taking the time to come in.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
So with all the episodes, I like to just start off where you were born and raised.
So I was born in Greenport Hospital and raised in Peconic on the family farm, right on the main road there. My grandparents farmed across the street in Peconic. My maternal grandparents, the Siders, they farmed in Mattituck. And I grew up with my sister, Sue, and my brother, Jim. And, we had a very nice life there in Peconic.
And was that pretty much normal to be born at the Greenport Hospital?
Yes.
Because there wasn't...
Well, my father was born at the Greenport Hospital. My mother was born at home on Oregon Road. So it was still a mix back then. And, of course, now, like with my daughters and daughter-in-law, now they're having the babies at home again with midwives.
Oh.
So it went back to that. It's kind of interesting the way,
wow.
The way things work like that. But
and so going back from there, how far back does your ancestry go to the area?
So most of my great grandparents emigrated from we were always told it was Poland, but because they came before World War I, all the lines in Europe shifted, kind of on a pretty regular basis, and. So my great-grandfather, Joe Krupski, who owned the farm where Pindar Vineyard is there in Peconic, he came over with his two brothers and a cousin, and they called him Ruski because he could understand and speak Russian. So obviously he came from the Russian side of Poland where, he was exposed to the Russian language as well as the Polish. And so that all the community there in Peconic, that's what they called him. And, he was part of that farming community there. And they were, mostly Yankees there at the time, but, he fit in, and they, I have all kinds of stories of them playing cards with neighbors and socializing with neighbors and everything. So, but when they first came, a lot of the Polish worked in the brickyards here, where Goldsmiths Marina is and where Brick Cove Marina are. There was a big brickyards, big industries, and so they found ready work there right away.
That's what they did before
they bought farms.
Farms.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And did they say specifically why they came over?
I think things were so bad where they lived that there was just no prospects, and it was dangerous. The wars kept sweeping through, and then you could be conscripted into the army at any time. So the story I always got about my great grandfather Joe, once he had bought the farm in Peconic and he had a little prosperity, he wanted to go back to see his family. And I never got the date from my parents. It must have been, I would guess, around before World War I. And there was so much turmoil there. He traveled all the way back to his home village, stayed one night, and they said, "You should leave. They're watching you. It's not safe for you here." And he went home back to Peconic. So,
wow.
So they were very happy to come to this country and be because it was peaceful.
And did they come through Ellis Island?
I think so, yes.
Yeah. And then work their way out here.
They must have had a connection.
Yeah.
Usually there's some sort of connection, some family or friends that said, "Hey, look, there's work out here. You should come out here and live."
And that was on your father's.
My father's side, the Krupski side.
The Krupski side, and then what about your mother's side going back?
So the Siders, my parents actually went to Poland, and they went on a regular 2-week tour, and then one of the workers on our farm that had gone back to Poland because they came and he stayed for a few years and worked for us. He arranged for a driver for my parents, and they went around and they looked for family records, and they found a lot of records where the ciders came from, more like central Poland. So that was very interesting. But they said the Krupskis came from way to the east. Probably they speculated where Belarus is today. That's where our branch of the family came from.
And then they came out this way to the East End as well.
Yes,
for
it was
work.
economic opportunity.
And when did they decide to buy the Krupskis decide to buy the farm?
1908 is when they bought it.
Did you get to meet your grandparents?
Well, my grandparents, yes, very close. My grandparents on both sides, yes. Not great grandparents. From my mother's side, it was the Bialeskis on her mother's side, and I remember, and in Polish it's Baci and Jaji, so I remember them very faintly. We were very small then. But my grandparents, yes, we grew up with my grandparents being part of our, not everyday lives, but almost everyday lives.
And did they have any stories about working on the farm or what it was like at that time living out here?
Well, sure. And they had very good lives, farming out here, because in their time of farming, they were pretty successful after World War II. There was a lot of economic prosperity on the farms. Whether it was, of course, potatoes were king. And so I grew up basically on a potato farm. And we did go into vegetables. Some of my fondest memories of being out in the field with my father and grandfather, cutting cabbage and cauliflower in the fall and into the winter. And digging potatoes was not, I think that was the worst, because then they built these storages and they had to store the potatoes. And if the potatoes didn't hold up, it was not a good year, because they would break. You go through all that year growing them and storing them, and then if they would break down in storage, you had a big problem. So that was always kind of traumatic. But no, I saw my grandparents work very hard on the farm, and they worked when they had to work, and both grandmothers worked, because that's what you did. And both my parents worked very hard on the farm. I mean, my mother picked a lot of beans and a lot of peas, with a crew of whatever labor force we could find, from school kids on up, and she picked a lot of peas and a lot of beans all those years.
And then you said it was mostly potato fields,
yes.
though?
Oh, very much so.
Very much.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the potatoes, the market changed with the potatoes in the late 70s, and the market changed. People didn't eat fresh market potatoes as much. Plus the competition, the mechanized competition from further west, the Midwest and further west, for all the crops became such that there used to be a seasonal variation in potato prices and produce prices. Suppose there was an early freeze in Maine, their crop would be affected, or a heavy drought, hot weather in the Carolinas or Delmarva Peninsula, so their crop would be affected. That meant Long Island potato prices would go up that year. And they'd have enough money to pay. They'd buy vehicles or equipment or, school education for their kids, or you'd pay your expenses on a good year. Once they started with these big, and my grandfather on my mother's side, John Sider, he had a lot of friends in the industry, and he said he could see all those big potato storages being built out in the Midwest, up to 1,000,000 hundredweight, where they could keep them stored properly with humidity and temperature. And so if the price changed anywhere in the country, they would be shipping potatoes into that. So it took away the price variation. So between that, and there was more of a demand for processed potatoes and less demand for fresh market, it really hurt the Long Island potato industry, because everything's more expensive to do anything on Long Island in a business, because you have to truck everything through New York City. So the cost of everything's so much higher.
Wow. So that's one of the main reasons why you saw the decline.
Absolutely.
Here.
It's just an economic reality of raising potatoes on Long Island. It was made it very difficult. And then with cauliflower, I got out of college, and I'm a plant science major. So what I heard in college, Long Island cauliflower is famous. So all the cooperative extensions across the country pushed growers. They said, look, you want to raise something that's valuable, raise cauliflower. So instead of the price around Thanksgiving of cauliflower going up locally, the price actually went down around Thanksgiving, because the market was flooded with cauliflower from all over the country. So that really hurt the cauliflower market, because that was a big commodity also. So it's all economics on the farm. You really need to make money. That's the bottom line. And it's seasonal business. So you're subject to the rules of Mother Nature. So it's a difficult, that's the difficulty there.
But through your family, was there any years that were tougher than others, or with your father, did they think that they wouldn't be able to get as much yield that year?
Oh, absolutely. There were absolutely. There were a lot of years that because of weather or forces outside of what we could control, market forces, where we'd have great crops, but there was just no market. Especially in my day with the cauliflower. We would cut, my father and I would cut cauliflower all fall, and into the winter, we'd cut 100 to 150 crates a day, 6 days a week. And beautiful, beautiful cauliflower. And sometimes you'd ship it into the market and they would say, no sale. What does that mean? You just lose all that. All that would be gone. And some of those dealers went to jail afterwards because that happened a lot. And they killed the goose that laid the golden egg. Because farmers were willing to grow and produce this food. And we just couldn't get paid enough for it.
And then, so just back to your parents, so where did they go to school out here?
So my father went to Southold High School, my mother went to Matituck.
And your father definitely knew he was going to go in to follow his footsteps.
Yes, he was an only child, and so he wanted to farm. We have a lot of pictures of him, when he was young. We have a lot of family pictures, which is great to see. To see the development, because you always think of, what it's like when you're a kid. You always think, your grandparents were always old, right? But, you think about their lives when they were young and how their lives developed, so it's nice to have the photographs so that you can really see that and see how their lives changed as they grew.
And then how did your parents meet? Because they went to different schools, but
I think through church, Our Lady of Rochelle. Yes. So the families would, there was church was a very big social, more of a social setting back then. My father said TV ruined everything because the neighbors used to get together in the evenings and the parents would sit on the porch and talk and the kids would run around and play. And he said, once TV came, it changed everything, So the socialization of neighbors, a lot of that was curtailed. And
then coming up to you grew up in
Peconic.
Peconic.
So I went to East Catrogue School. And when I went to East Catrogue School, when I started, there were 4 classrooms with 4 teachers and 8 grades. So it was very different then, too. And everyone thought, of course, that was normal. So it was East Catrogue School, and then it was West Catrogue on depot land there. And then they consolidated afterwards. So every grade had their own teacher in their own classroom.
And then as a kid, would you get would your parents cook a lot of the food that you got from the farm, or was it mostly?
No, that's what you ate. You ate. They had big chest freezers. So my grandfather, John Sider, he always raised steers. And then my uncle John, he raised steers afterwards in Matituck. So you had a freezer full of grass-fed beef, which you thought was normal. Because that's what you grew up with. When you grow up, you think that's normal. We had a barn full of potatoes, so we ate potatoes twice a day.
Wow!
And then whatever vegetables, we ate a lot of vegetables. And then we also knew a lot of people who fished, so we ate a lot of fish because they traded vegetables for fish and scallops, eels. So we ate a lot of the local. Anything local we were eating because it was it was a nice healthy barter system. So that was so growing up we ate very well.
Did you, with the potatoes, would you get tired of it after a while, or?
It's funny because we would have, my mother would cook rice once in a while, twice a year, and we'd be like, Ma, rice again? So we never got tired of it.
Wow.
No, I still love potatoes to this day. And we had a good growing up because I mentioned all the shellfish and fin fish and everything. And so while as kids, we rode our bike to the beach. When we were older, we could work on the farm in the morning. In the afternoon was for going to the beach and swimming and because growing up out here, you're close to the water. We went all, and my mother took us like every day when we
Mm.
were little. It was, that's what, we worked, but, you took advantage of the water. And my father would come down in the evenings, we'd go to the beach, and, we never had a boat, but we just splash around and play,
That's
play.
kind of what you did for fun as a kid.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, yeah.
You can kind of just, it was pretty much was wide open for you to kind of explore and
Yes, we rode our bikes all over the place. Yes,
Mhm.
and it gave you the sense of responsibility too, because you
Mhm.
had to be, if you were going to have that freedom, you had to be responsible, so you couldn't get into trouble. And I always knew also that if I got into trouble, there'd be so much work for me at home that I'd be too tired to go out and make any mischief.
Yes. And so in school, how was your experience through school, kind of elementary, middle school, high school?
I mean, it was a good. Like I said, it started at East Control with all the grades up together, K through 8 on the same playground and the same, and so everybody, everybody kind of had. I see some of my old classmates now and then, and it's funny to think about those days, and again, there was I think a lot of freedom back then for kids.
Mhm.
I think the technology's made it harder. I see it kind of transitioned with my children. And now we have 6 grandchildren. Mary and I have six
Wow.
grandchildren. So we've been married 38 years. So we've seen all the changes. And it's harder with all the technology. It was easier with the kids to go outside and play. Go outside and play. That was it, right?
Mhm.
And you had toys, of course, a ball or a bicycle or whatever. But we weren't deprived, but playing
They
with just
weren't just constantly on their, like looking at
right,
their screen
right, right.
all the time.
So I think it was a lot simpler and a lot easier.
Hmm. And then, so coming out of high school, did you know you wanted to go into, because you went into plant science,
Yes.
but when you were in high school, were you thinking that you wanted to continue on in that uh, path or career?
So when I was in high school, it was I didn't really think it was I didn't know it was an option. I had an older sister, she went to college. So I
Hmm.
thought, well, I'm going to go to college. It was kind of like my parents supported me. So I was going to go to college. It wasn't like, should I go to college or not go to college, right?
Hmm.
And I chose plant science because I always liked science. And I had some very good science teachers in Mattituck High School. And I enjoyed the curriculum, at plant science. I took a lot of soil chemistry, plant pathology, plant physiology. Really, really enjoyed the curriculum. And when I got out, I was, my father and I were going to raise a lot of cauliflower and be successful. And my old high school chemistry teacher, Frank Kioski, and our neighbor, Paul Stoutenberg, who was a really noted environmentalist on Skunk Lane there in Cutchogue, they said, "Oh, you should run for office." And I didn't know anything about politics at all,
Hmm.
Democrat, Republican, nothing at all. I was never engaged in that. I always did get the Suffolk Times while I was away at college, and just to read up on local events. And one thing that was always kind of like a dark cloud hanging over the North Fork was all the development on the South Fork at the time in the late 70s and early 80s.
Hmm.
There was a lot of development going on. A lot of the really good farmland in Bridgehampton and Sagaponack was being lost to development. And
Hmm.
there was a concern here of what it could have happened here, what's going to happen. So I kind of followed that through the newspaper. And then when they asked me to run, I said, yeah, why not? I should be engaged. I want to stay in this community. I should get involved. And so 1983, I ran, and I did not get elected. In 1984, I ran in a special election, and the Board of Elections did not certify a winner for a whole year,
Hmm.
which was kind of strange considering it was a special election for town trustee in 1984. So looking back on it, it was very strange. And then I ran against Ellen Latson, who, we became very close during the campaign and during the following year. She and I attended every town trustee meeting. And in 1985, we both got elected in the general election as
Hmm.
town trustees, and we worked together very well. She moved on to the town board right after that. I stayed as a town trustee for 20 years. And I was very fortunate, though, when I started as a town trustee, because I was a Democrat. I got elected with these Republicans and a conservative, people I didn't know. And they couldn't have been nicer. They couldn't have been more welcoming. And we worked together as an elected board, not as members of a political party. And I think that was it was a really good, I was fortunate to have people like that to work with, from the beginning. And it taught me a lot. You're working for the town, you're not working for a political party.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so people were asking you to run right after college?
Right after college, yes.
Wow.
Yes, I was 23.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then when you were a trustee for Southold, what issues were going on at that time that you were working on? Was there a lot of development that you saw come in at that time, similar to the South Fork, or people were still more focused down there and not as much up here?
No, it happened. It was, if you recall, in the mid 80s, that big Wall Street boom. And so that drove a lot of money out to the East End for people to make real estate investments. So it started kind of right away as soon as I got elected of pressure on development on the waterfront. And so and the trustees were in an interesting place there because you're making land use decisions on people's backyards if you got to build a home or addition or whatnot. But also, if they want to put a dock out, that's public land. So the public has property rights over all that underwater land that the town owns. And so it's kind of a very interesting policy place where you're trying to make those proper decisions to protect the public's property rights as well. So those were, the development pressure started right away. We weren't so much prepared for them because it's hard to be prepared for everything that comes your way in the future. And it took us quite a while to realize that we had made adjustments in policy in all those years as a trustee. Finally, we got to the place where we had to rewrite the wetland code from top to bottom to address the realities of what was going on in our community.
And then just in general, how would you kind of, I guess, said it a little bit with how things were changing, but in that time, how would you just describe the North Fork and what it felt like at that time?
I think it was a much quieter place. Greenport certainly had not been revitalized into what the beautiful place it was then, and so it was a much more seasonal place. We were still a lot of second homeowners. That hasn't changed. There were a lot of seasonal homes and a lot of second homeowners. And growing up in East Cutchogue, you look at the kind of the backyard there, Nassau Point and Nassau Farms, all those areas there, Little Neck, Indian Neck. I knew that we playing at the beach, you'd play with the summer kids because they were out for the summer. And then they'd be gone. You would go to school with them in the fall. So it was, in that respect, that hasn't changed at all. So culturally, that part's very, very similar.
Yes. And so you were on you were a trustee for 20 years.
Yes.
And then you became a
town board
member. What year was that?
2005. I got elected to the town board. Well, the reason I ran for the town board is because we had just rewritten the wetland code with the trustees. We addressed a lot of things like drainage. We were looking at land uses, how it affects shellfishing opportunities. What are the impairments that close shellfish beds for recreational commercial harvesting? We've got 22 creeks out here, and people can't go out and catch a mess of clams. That's what they want to come out here to live here for, right?
Yes.
And so we worked hard with the DEC closes the shellfish beds. They're the regulatory agency. So we worked closely with the DEC. We did projects on Mattatuck Inlet, on Hashimomic Pond here, working with the DEC, working with Suffolk County Department of Public Works. This was going back decades because the impairments a lot of it came from road runoff. So all the pathogens that were getting washed in after a heavy rain would close the shellfish beds. So we said, okay, we have to do drainage, and the drainage is expensive. But drainage paid off in two ways. One, we did get different shellfish beds open, either seasonally or year round. So that was and obviously improving water quality as we went.
Mm-hmm.
We also recharged the aquifer there. Instead of all that rainwater going straight into the creek, all that rainwater goes into the aquifer. And so that program continues today. I'm very happy to see that the town was embarked on this wonderful program between the town engineer, the town board, and the highway superintendent as partners, cutting off outfalls. So all that rainwater, instead of carrying pollutants and pathogens going into our surface waters and closing shellfish beds, now is recharging our aquifer. You think about a 2-inch rainfall, how many millions of gallons of water that is, and that's like putting money in the bank. So we started that a long time ago because of the shellfishing impacts.
And did you get any pushback at the time for?
Well, it's expensive, so it's changing the culture of saying we need to do this as a town. This is important. You figure over how many 100 years, all the town roads and state and county roads are designed to shed the water off the roads, and it goes downhill. So the easiest place to put it is into the wetlands and into the creeks. So it's just a mindset of changing the culture to say there's a benefit to spending that money to change your infrastructure. And so once we did that, and we kind of got that, the culture definitely changed, and we put the drainage code into the wetland code. When I got elected to the town board, I was very concerned about town-wide drainage, and we passed the town-wide drainage code. But that was when, if you think about 2005, there was that big mortgage bubble.
Mm-hmm.
It was getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Mm-hmm.
And we knew it would burst. But on the other hand, in the meantime, how do we deal with the impacts of that bubble getting bigger and bigger?
Mm-hmm.
And so we made a lot of really, I think, good land use decisions to try to control development overall upland, to try to keep our town as preserved as possible.
You think before the bubble in 2008, you were getting a lot of proposals to the planning board for housing developments at that time?
Yes, and so the town has the CPF, the Community Preservation Fund, and that funds our preservation efforts, as well as Suffolk County did some farmland and open space preservation also to complement what the town was doing. The problem was what happened in Suffolk County. They borrowed heavily against future revenues on the 0.25% money. And so right now, 2/3 of the money that should go for land preservation goes towards debt service in the county. And so we were under a lot of pressure back then in 2006, 2007, when the real estate market was really going crazy again, to do the same thing. You should borrow against future revenues. Riverhead Town did do that, and they almost all of their income now goes towards debt service that they should be preserving land with. So we didn't want to get into that scenario where we weren't sure if the bubble burst, which it did, if we're going to have the revenues to support land preservation if we borrow too heavily. So we resisted doing that at the time.
And then moving forward, how did the position come up for the Suffolk County Legislator?
Well, I got a call in early in 2012 from Rich Schaefer, and he said, "Would you be interested in running?" And I'd been a trustee for 20 years. I'd been on the town board for 7 years or 6 years at the time, and I had never considered running for county legislator because I was still a farmer mentally. I was still very much engaged in the family farm, and I wasn't really looking for a career as an elected official. This is 2012, and I said, well, I can't say yes, but I won't say no. So Mary and I talked it over. In 2012, our children were getting older. They were either in college or just out of college. So that wasn't a barrier to having little kids at home and whatnot. And so, and I had left it with him. I said, "You call me if you're really serious about this, about me running." And it must have been, so it was 2012. So then I didn't hear from Rich. And so, May and June and July fell into August and September, and it was like, okay, they found somebody who was, better qualified or better dressed or whatever. And I said, all right, so we kind of put it off. And then the day after the election, I was walking in town hall with Scott Russell, and he said, "Oh, I hear you're running for county legislator." And I'm like, "Where did you hear that?" He said, "Oh, it was announced on TV last night." So I said, well, I guess I am. So, and it was funny because I was scheduled to go in for a full hip replacement in December of that December. So I went in, and the special election was in January. So I went in for the hip replacement in mid-December, and by New Year's I was back up and running again, and ran and successfully won in mid-January for the special election. So that was that would have been 2013, the beginning of 2013.
And then you were there.
That's a 2-year term. So I ran in January in the special election. I ran in November of that year in the regular election. And then every November since.
And for District 1.
District 1, yeah, which is geographically the largest district. So it was became a challenge right away, getting to know all of Riverhead Town in east of Brookhaven, because I went as far west as Shirley, Brookhaven National Lab, all the way down to east and center Mauritius, and all of Manorville. That was a really big district. So
it's kind of like stepping into that from working on the town board, that was a lot.
And I met a lot of wonderful people because you got to know the chambers and the civics and the fire departments there. So I met a lot of wonderful communities there, and I was lucky to represent them.
And what would you say the issues were that you had to deal with stepping into that role and over time there?
Well, the county has a lot of different responsibilities. A lot of it had to do with highway use. So I was chair of public works for 9 years. And a lot of it had to do with things that I was familiar with, highways and drainage and dredging. So the county does the dredging and in their charter. But then there are all the other issues that the county deals with. You look at the Department of Social Services, which is massive and serves and helps a lot of people in the county. So it's a big, diverse county. And it was it was a very good learning experience for me, certainly.
And through that time, what would you say you were most proud of that you accomplished in that role on the legislature?
I think a lot of it was just representing the East End as a distinct area, because the county is so diverse. You really have the East End and the West End, and to just represent the interests of the East End as when people come out here, they don't always see us as having an economy. Because we don't have factories, we don't have strip malls, we don't have big box stores, so it looks like there's nothing going on here. When in fact there's quite a big economy out here. We just look differently.
Yes.
So, and I think a lot of that was just conveying that. And also, if you look at the seal of the Suffolk County Legislature, it's a plow. And I was the first farmer in 50 years to ever sit on the legislature, and yet that's our seal. So that was good because I was able to, kind of educate, and I got educated by a lot of really smart people too, because the county also does a lot with the fire safety. They run the fire school, and they run, a lot of emergency management, a lot of communications. So that was a very good education too, and how those things are coordinated. So it was a good collaboration. I made a lot of good friends that served as legislators in various districts further west. You became close with certain people, and you learned about what was important in their districts.
And I guess more while you were in that role, did you think of running for anything more at the state level in Albany? So
when you're in the legislature, you're termed out after 12 years. So I could have run for one more term as legislature because I came out on a special. And we actually have to change the law to make that very clear that it's 12 years total. So I could have done 13 to fill out my term, but that would have been it. So I had always, in the back of my mind, absolutely. Do I want to continue as an elected official? Do I want to continue in public service, and at what capacity? It was always a thought that Mary and I talked about.
But then the opportunity came up to be the Southold Town Supervisor. Yes. So you decided not to run again.
Exactly. When Scott said he wasn't going to run again, it was a good opportunity for me to run for that position because I do know the town, and it's and actually I'm very fortunate. There's so many good people who work in the town that I know that I've worked with in the past.
Yes.
Some quite a bit in the past 11 years, and some before 11 years that I've worked with.
Mm.
So it's more than comforting. It's more of a like a mechanical, because government, that you do have to keep the wheels turning. So there's a mechanical part of the government that it's not the policy part. It's like how to keep the lights on type of thing, and the buildings maintained and all that. That's all part of the mechanical things of government. People have to issue permits, and all that has to keep working together.
And you were happy to come back into that role here.
Mm-hmm.
And going into the election, you felt like you had a good reputation of working, probably 27 years with the Southold Town and then just with the legislature. So you definitely had the experience and everything to step back into this role.
Yes, it was a big advantage having grown up here and having worked here for so long. Definitely, yeah. It's still a learning curve. I won't say that it's not. It's still been a big learning curve in the past month. But again, it's a lot of the mechanics of how things are working, and I'm always been big on, and maybe because I come from the farm, like, can we do something better? Can we make it more efficient? I always think my father always said that they used to hoe rows for weeds at the end of the potatoes. And it's when he got married, his brother-in-law said, you get a little disc and you go up and down the edge of the field, you kill all the weeds, then you go clamming in the evening. You have time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of like the same thing. You really have to be a little more efficient in government if you can be. If you're going to be responsible for having some jurisdiction, make the process fair for people, because it's time that really is a valuable commodity that you have to be conscious of.
And so you said it's been somewhat of a learning curve, but coming into the role. But how has it been so far since you've been involved now as the town supervisor?
Oh, yeah, it's been great, but it's been, just trying to figure out the mechanics, because I've been gone for so long, just trying to figure out the mechanics of, my responsibilities are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what would you say are coming into this role, what would you say are the three major issues for you that you want to work on for the town?
Oh, sure. So I know the one that's come to the forefront because of all the flooding is definitely the coastal resiliency piece. I was involved because people talked a lot about housing as being very important, and so the housing is still very important, because if you look at the cost of housing, and people say, well, nobody can afford to live here. Well, a lot of people can. That's why the houses are selling for so much money, because people can afford to live here. Mm-hmm. And they're coming here for quality of life reasons, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to be mindful of that. They're coming here for a reason. They're spending that much money for a house because they can. They could live a lot of other places in the world, but they want to come here. So we have to maintain the quality of life aspect of it, whether it's, public safety or having, the basics of good roads, or you could go in and you get your beach sticker and everything works smoothly, right? Mm-hmm. The coastal resiliency part is and as far as the housing part goes, if it were simple, it would have been done already, solved already. It's very complicated yes. on how to provide people, because of the cost of labor and the cost of materials, how to provide low-cost housing. It's very complicated. And then how much housing should you provide? And riding to Riverhead on weekdays for 11 years, you saw the traffic going back and forth. One of my daughters is an audiologist, and she was working in Southampton office, and the trade parade over there was, the traffic, because people who didn't live there but were working there every day, getting there. It's something you can somewhat mitigate by having the workforce live in town, right? Because they're not driving on those roads every morning and every evening. So that's something that is certainly, and it is being actually worked on now. The housing, they started this very good housing advisory committee. The town last year developed this housing plan, and so I think that's going forward in some fashion. Certainly not going to meet everyone's need. I mean, that's just impossible to meet everyone's housing need for every different economic strata. But it's something that everyone's taking very seriously and is committed to working on in town. The coastal resiliency piece. So coming from the old trustee in me, we took over the coastal erosion hazard area on Long Island Sound from the New York State in 1991, really without any guidance. And it was a state-run law. The trustees had to administer it. It was fairly confusing because the forces of coastal erosion on Long Island Sound are way different from like a nice, quiet, vegetated creek front. We made that adjustment, but now I have to tell you, with sea level rise, it's been a complete game changer as far as the coastal erosion and the wetlands, and you can see the flooding on our roads on a regular basis. And as a community, how are we going to respond to that real reality? You see it all across Long Island. I'm sure all across the world, right? You hear the stories about islands that are like people live there and they're going to be like underwater. So when I started the first week, we had a meeting with the highway superintendent and the town engineer and our GIS coordinator. And I said, we need a map. We kind of marked up a map of the town. Where are the spots of town-owned infrastructure that we own? What floods on a regular basis now that never flooded before? And we're having a meeting coming up this Thursday with all the fire chiefs. With this emergency management committee that's established in town that as supervisor I'm part of. And so that's a great resource because their job is emergency management. When something floods, it's a catastrophic event. Who does the work, right? Who's supposed to do the work, and how do they communicate? So the first thing with the mapping is going to be, if you live in a community that's now cut off on a regular basis by salt water, how are you going to react? Is there an alternate way to get into home without driving through that salt water and putting yourself in danger? Because we hear stories, the highway department goes and puts up barricades so people can go an alternate route. Somebody moves a barricade, and then the rest of the traffic for the rest of the day or night is going through the water because the barricade's aside, it must be safe. So the emergency routing has to be really coordinated and put on a map, and everyone needs to know. From the communities to the fire departments to the police department, everyone needs to know this is an alternate route. You shouldn't be driving through the salt water, really, unless you really need to for some reason. And then you don't want to put people at risk, your emergency responders at risk of going into a storm event, especially in the dark or something, into driving through deep water. The second part of that is when you look at building and land use on the waterfront that's flooded more often, the town's also in the middle of the zoning update. And so I've been part of that. There's another meeting coming up on Thursday. And I've asked to put an overlay district on our shoreline at a certain elevation so people know in that elevation their home should be elevated if they're going to do any work on them to a certain height so that they will be, if there is a big storm, they won't be at risk. Their mechanicals and everything will be high and dry. Their house might be surrounded by water, but their house will be above the water at least, and it won't be in the water. Yes. We saw that in the 90s. We had the Halloween storm, the perfect storm, and a lot of people got flooded out then along the waterfront, and like feet of water in their first floor. Basements flooded completely, and it was pretty traumatic, right? That kind of flooding. After they dried out and fixed everything, a year and a half later, we have the Christmas Eve storm. And that did a tremendous amount of damage to the shoreline, but it also flooded a lot of the same people out. And after that, so I know as a trustee, a lot of people elevated their homes after that. So through the 90s, a lot of homes were raised, and a lot of properties were raised in response to being flooded out twice in a year and a half. So there's a history in town of that happening. Yes. And then not being there during Sandy, and I said that a lot of people are second homeowners or their summer residences. They weren't out here, during Sandy. So they weren't people that had to be rescued, God forbid, if they had a medical emergency. So you have that advantage too, because there was a mandatory evacuation by Suffolk County during Sandy, which I was on the town board, and we were scratching our heads. We said, no one could ever remember that before. And it was for good reason, it turns out. But to get out of harm's way, so you're not trying to send people in to rescue people. People are high and dry. If they have another place to go, where do they go? They should plant. And that's kind of the message that we're putting out there now, meeting with civics. People should know if there's a forecast storm event, can you go somewhere else? Are you prepared? Do you have, a bag you can pack, food you can take? or if you're going to stay there, if you're high and dry, but you're going to be cut off, you won't have electric for how long? Be prepared. Have your water, have your candles, have your food, so that you can live comfortably for a week and not be distressed. Help each other out. You have neighbors. Maybe you have extra tuna fish and I have extra candles. Help each other out as neighbors. Because if there's a catastrophic event, people will get to help us eventually, but all Long Island's going to be in trouble. All New York City's going to be in trouble. So people aren't going to just come out here to help us first.
Yes.
So that's kind of the mentality. They also work on emergency shelters. They haven't opened an emergency shelter up in years because there was no need to. But these are set up and staffed by volunteers. And so the volunteers need to be trained. You can't just say, oh, the storm's coming in 5 days. All right, what do? These people have to be ready to go and be trained. What their roles are. So that's going to, we really have to look at that and make sure that after so many years of not doing it, these people are still available to be volunteers, shelter volunteers, and then is their training up to date and everything? What are our responsibilities as a town? Because we're going to have to, in a catastrophic event, really be responsible for ourselves for a while. And I think the utility company has done a good job after Sandy, just being around the East End a lot in the last 11 years. I've seen the utility company put up a lot of big poles and a lot of tree trimming, and the town's done a lot of tree trimming, so that in these last storm events we've had very few outages, and that's so that's really important to keep up with that kind of maintenance.
And with some of the environmental stuff, do you even see on the North Road, say between East Marion and Orient, that road out there, do you see eventually that having to have an overpass into the future?
That's one of the things that we're looking at, and that's another reason for the mapping. So with Suffolk County, a couple of years ago, and it was Legislator Fleming who really started it with the initial storm resiliency push. The county did under Steve Ballone, who was the county executive, and I was part of the beginning phases of it. We looked at county-owned infrastructure, and they identified the county-owned, of course, the road here coming out all the way out to Greenport. From Mattituck to Greenport, it's County Road 48. There's a couple low spots there by Town Beach and, of course, by Mattituck Inlet. So we're going to do the same thing in town, identifying those areas, but we have to be partners. If there's going to be any road reconstruction or road raising, we have to be partners because a lot of it ties in with, one, private property. So we have to be mindful, if you raise a road, how does it affect private property? And two, how does it affect the town roads coming into it? So New York State DOT is going to have to be a partner in that also on the main road. And that's a state road from Greenport to Orient, so they're going to have to be a partner in that.
Yes. And then you mentioned the housing that people are able to buy houses out here, but it's definitely still in a certain bracket of class, or what you would want to call it. But in order to try to balance that out in the future, you're saying it's still tough to try to balance it out for everyone, with whether it's affordable housing and then also wanting smart development, more sustainable, environmentally friendly, and not, would you say you wouldn't want sprawl?
Exactly.
More close.
Exactly. It's avoiding the sprawl. And I was part of a lot of the town, I think, reacted in the 80s to a lot of the development, not only in the South Fork, but further west. And they saw how communities changed when all the farmland became developed with tract housing. And they saw what happened especially with the traffic impacts, and the big malls and tract housing really changed their communities really forever. And so Southold embarked on a bunch of different planning exercises. There was Southold 2000, like what will happen to Southold in the year 2000.
Yes.
And they did the US-UK exchange. People actually went over to Southwold, England, and looked at their land use because, they have a compact town and all that land on the outside that's rural. And so the goal, I think the culture, it was easy to change back then towards how can we keep Southold, keep the hamlets together, and prevent that sprawl. Keep all your development and resources and business in the hamlets. and just prevent the strip malls and the tract housing from happening. And then the previous board previous to me, the Josh Horton Town Board, with they developed the Hamlet stakeholder groups, which were volunteer groups, and they worked parcel by parcel in each hamlet to develop like a halo area to say this is as big as the hamlet as we want it to get. We don't want it to get beyond that. So I think that was very helpful because I think that helped shape all the planning efforts in the town. All those early planning efforts. People realize if we don't plan for it, the world's just going to pave us right over. And talking to old workers from the Suffolk County Health Department who have long since retired, they thought back in the 60s and 70s that it was just going to be Levittown unfolded again and again. So you hit Orient and the Montauk Points. They thought that's how it was going to go with sewer and water lines, and it was just going to be Levittown all the way out. And that's what they were prepared for.
So yeah, you see that west of here.
Right. Yes.
Kind of when you get to Middle Island West, but it's nice that hasn't happened here. And I think even some of those, if you look at some of the land use planning in Europe and Germany, England, and just seeing that they do keep the farmlands and have it spaced out and do more compact development, and then they don't have to worry about having to widen the highways or worry about the transportation after that because all the development went in beforehand, and then you have this whole problem with parking. And obviously we have that, but it's not at the same level as other areas. But
right, and because we've done that, and it was done very deliberately, and that's why people want to come here to visit, and then they come to visit, and then they say, "Well, we should live here." It's so nice, right? Because you have access to the water that you can swim in every day. And I mentioned all the drainage work that had been done over the decades. If you look, you don't have to go too far west because Suffolk County Health Department does the beach closures in the summertime, and so many beaches are affected in western Suffolk for rainfall events. They're closed all summer. So if the beaches are closed and you can't go swimming in the summer, talk about a hit on your economy. That's what people come out here to do, to boat and to fish and to swim. So very deliberate steps were taken over the years to keep the area, I say rural. Of course, it's changed a lot in my lifetime, but it's still relatively quiet.
Yes. And just in terms of politics in the U.S. and the environment, you're known for working across party lines. And have you seen a change, I guess, since 2010, just with you have the more extreme right and extreme left, and just it's a little more hostile. How are you able, you're working more at the town level, which I think people can come together more, but it's tougher in the state and federal.
I think what people need to do is, first of all, they need to spend more time with their colleagues. So if you and I disagree on something, really, it's black and white to us. It's completely opposites. On the other hand, if we're both elected officials, that's one issue we're dealing with out of 100. So I think the way to do that is you find common ground on other things, and then you say, okay, let's work together on this instead. And you work together successfully on that, and then you kind of build on that. And you might never agree on the first thing, ever. But that's okay, because we're all people, right? And our lives are here just at that moment in time now. So you have to find common ground and work on things together. Because there's a limited capacity in government to do everything. And you see there's so many demands, and if you either follow the news or follow what's going on with government, there's so many demands that we should do this, we should do that, we should do that, we should do this. A lot of it's conflicting, and a lot of it's impossible just because of time and resources. And not that they're bad ideas. It's just that it's just impossible to do everything. So I think to your question of how do you kind of dismiss the politics from it, is to find common issues that benefit the community and work on those together. Because that's where you got to spend your time then.
Yes.
And your time is limited.
Yes, and whether you, like you said, you agree on or you don't agree on that issue, it shouldn't get hung up totally or
No,
just say, oh, well, you're automatically going to think of that person as this or that. And
exactly,
you're
exactly.
not, it's going to be not a good working environment.
Right. Because then if you dismiss them out of hand, you'll never get to work with them as colleagues on something that's beneficial. Yeah.
So over the years, what have you enjoyed about living and working on the North Fork overall?
Well, I mean, living here, it's a I really do appreciate it. And someone, I don't know who said it, but just be grateful and mindful of where you are
Mhm.
and what's there. And so that's easy to do, and having grown up on the farm and having that kind of freedom, I think has been a big benefit to me. Having, Mary and I raised our children on the farm, and that's been a big benefit to them, having those kind of freedoms and opportunities. And so I see the real benefit to living out here. So that I think that's so then it's easy to say, okay, I see the benefit, and I see why people who can want to still move out here
Mhm.
because it's a quality of life issue.
And would you say, I mean, do you miss anything about the way the North Fork used to be? Or obviously, there's some things you might miss, but you had to move forward
It's
with.
well, it's weird because the freedoms that we had as kids, if you look at something as simple as all the deer fencing.
Mm,
So growing up, because you can't just ride through people's fields anymore on your bicycle.
mhm,
Growing up, you could do that, but also growing up, there was no deer on the North Fork. So talk about a whole change in our natural environment that was brought upon by New York State DEC's failure to manage the deer population
mhm,
because the town has no authority there. And so now you've got this deer population. So New York State, they didn't want to control the population on Long Island differently than the rest of the state. So the solution was to have them help fund deer fencing. So growers could, because we couldn't raise anything on the farm without fencing. It would be impossible. A deer is a big animal and they eat a lot, they do a lot of damage. So it would be impossible to raise a lot of the produce without fencing. So that changed the flow patterns of human activity, really.
mhm.
So it's kind of strange. And then if you look at the natural lands, we preserve so much between the states preserve some, but mostly the county and the town. We have a lot of good parks. I mean, the area west of Greenport Village, all the way through Heshimamic, on
Mhm.
both sides of the road, Beta Sound, most of that land is preserved,
Yes.
and it's really a huge block of beautiful, beautiful woods and swamps. But what the deer are doing to that, they're devegetating it, and someone called it an eco slum because they're everything from 6 feet on down, every branch. They won't let the saplings grow. There's no regeneration of the and recruitment of hardwood trees
Mhm.
because the deer are mowing everything down. So that's a huge change because we preserved all this land in its natural state and we want it to be natural. And the
Mhm.
deer are kind of preventing it from that regeneration happening.
Mhm.
We saw it on Robbins Island when Louis Bacon bought it. The deer it was overpopulated; they were starving, and we saw how stark the whole landscape was. There wasn't a branch or a stick below 6 feet,
Wow.
and so there was no regeneration of all the hardwood trees. And so you can see how quickly that can happen, and it's happening here. It's troubling a lot of people because then it affects all the habitat, all the ground nesting birds and whatnot. So it has a bad effect on other animals' habitat in all those what should be a natural environment. So yeah, it's weird the way things changed in my lifetime
Mhm.
from and how the deer changed that
Just the deer
dynamic.
and just
Just
the deer.
right, right.
And even with ticks
Oh, exactly. The
too.
tick, the proliferation of tick-borne illnesses, and I don't know anyone who hasn't been bitten by a tick,
Mhm.
and a lot of people have suffered, greatly from tick-borne illnesses. So sure,
Mhm.
there's a direct correlation there. The deer is a big vector for the ticks, and the ticks vector the disease, and there we go.
Yes.
And you want to encourage people to be outside
Yes.
and enjoy all our natural, parkland.
Yes.
So
No, definitely. And then just, I was curious, what do you hope for the future of Southold Town and the community down the line?
I think the word that you said is important is the community, because a lot of people were concerned, all these new people coming in, especially after COVID. Who are these people? Why are they coming here and all that? But I think it's up to us to embrace everybody who comes here. I think of my great grandparents, how they were welcomed into the community, and embrace all these people, make them part of our community. Join the library, join all of the town committees, join the Rotary or the Kiwanis and there's the chambers. There's so many things that they can join and be part of the community, and they should be integrated into our community and welcomed in, and then we're a community again, because it changes. People move around and all the time, and so you always have to keep it as that word, the community.
Yeah, and it's definitely, I think it can be tough, but you have to think how people have come out here in the past and have integrated, or if you don't want to use integrated, but just
Sure.
join the community and just try to work together well. Whereas some people, whether like some of them, a lot are coming from the city, and they might have different ideas about how things might be done, but just try to listen to the people who have been out here for a while and try to work with the people who have moved here recently. But I think it's definitely an interesting time, and there definitely has been change, but hopefully we can preserve the North Fork and some of the character and not have overdevelopment.
And that's it, the character. So you asked me for three things. I only said two, but the preservation is the third one, because all that open space we preserved, that's all watershed, that's all viewshed, and it's habitat for fauna and flora. And I think in the farmland preservation piece is just as important. Agriculture is going through a transition now, but if you have that base of preserved farmland, it's always there for food production in the future. So it's critical to keep preserving that. And of course, if you preserve farmland, the benefit there is it's in private hands. It still pays taxes. The municipality doesn't have any maintenance responsibilities on it. So that's the big benefit there if the farmland is preserved. And it's certainly part of the economy, if it's being farmed.
Do you see down the line farming still being a healthy part of the community? I mean, obviously, I think in like the Hargraves in the 70s, some of them started switching over to being vineyards, wineries.
Yes.
But do you see that I think some people have said they've been able to survive because of the wine tasting rooms and agro entertainment.
Sure.
But in terms of just farming in general, do you see, even like with yourself as a farmer, do you see farming staying within the land use and not just say, well, a farm they stopped producing and they're selling the land, but maybe it would be preserved through the land trust. But what about making sure that some of the farms still keep running without having to come to a situation where they might have to shut down?
Well, it's all economics. It's a business, and you have to make money farming. That's the bottom line. If they can figure out how to produce food or ornamentals, certainly, the nursery business or the greenhouse business with flowers and whatnot. Those are all very important businesses to the economy and to our culture to still be able to raise that. So but farmers, the bottom line is you have to make money. Because you still have to pay all your bills, and you have, and so. But what we can do, first off, is make sure there's enough preserved farmland so that someone in the future is going to have that opportunity. Because nobody knows what the future is going to hold. But if that opportunity is there, because we've done our job, then at least somebody has a chance.
And then just lastly, did you have any other things you'd like to discuss or say to our listeners?
No, I think I'm glad you brought up the community aspect at the end there, because I think that's the important part where where the world changes and everything changes, and you have to be comfortable with that knowledge, but then you have to be part of the change, and if there's got to be change, and how much there is of it is going to be. So I speak to school groups sometimes, and I always encourage them to get involved. I never thought I'd be a public servant for so many years. I didn't grow up thinking this is what I want to do. I didn't go to college thinking this is what I want to do, right? So you never know where the opportunity is going to take you, but to be part of the community, you don't have to be an elected official, just to be part of the community. That's where you make your impact.
So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come in today and your involvement and engagement since you were in your 20s till today, continuing your involvement in the community. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Chris. This is a great opportunity. You've got a great workspace here. Wow, this is really nice.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 22 with Southold Town Supervisor Al Krupski. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.